is something that I think is very much a part of the secret sauce of sorts here that Northeastern practices, but it's very much that animates all the researchers involved with this. And that ultimately involves engaging with civil society, with the private sector, with the corporate sector, and the non-profit foundations and so forth. We really have to build this ecology, this ecosystem, where we learn and share and invest and act all very collectively. Okay. So now we have our show on here. Let's see if I can operate this. So first, a definition of resilience. This is probably one of the few things that survived the election of 2016. That this is still the operative term. And actually, it's one of the great things I like about resilience. I've yet to find anybody who's against it. Right? No, I like firmness and fragility. Sign me up for that. So even a highly polarized society, it turns out everybody likes resilience a bit. Not quite sure what it is entirely, but it seems like a good thing. You should have more of it than less. And yet we are becoming more brittle and more fragile in lots of ways. But what I really like about this stuff, we have spent, and with FEMA from 2005 to 2014, less than $600 million in mitigating risk. And then when we have disasters, that same period of time, we spent $277.6 billion cleaning up the mess afterwards. Now, that arithmetic is not very smart. Given that the general number is $1 spent on mitigation equals $8 in savings when something goes bump in the night, and if these are happening with more frequency and intensity, you probably want to up your game on mitigation. But importantly, also, they're costly because we don't plan for recovery. We don't have good plans to get ourselves back up. And that also basically feeds to these high price tags. So what's animating this overall isn't necessarily that there are more hazards. There are when it comes to climate. It is we're hyper-connected. And so what used to be a local shock disruption is now far more disruptive and costly because of cascading failure. Let me give you an example. The largest natural disaster for a loss of life in U.S. history took place in the year 1900 in Galveston, Texas, by a storm that infamously called Isaac's Storm. If you were on Galveston Island that day, you were in trouble, because about a 15-foot storm surge from a hurricane arrived in a city where the highest point at that time was 10 feet. And a guesstimate is that 8,000 people perished with essentially the tsunami tidal wave almost thing that came across Galveston Island. It took 24 hours for the rest of the country to know what happened, because the telegraph lines were knocked down. It was a terrible thing to be in Galveston, but for the rest of the country, they were largely unaffected. Fast forward to Hurricane Harvey. Loss of life numbers were very nicely in very small numbers, like under 30. Not all bad, but that's amazing given the scale of the storm. Economic costs, not just locally, right, the impacts here, but nationally and internationally. You disrupted the Houston shipping channel. You disrupted the petrochemical industry, which maybe in some cases not so bad, but in some cases here not well planned or dealt with here. But that's where we are, why these things matter. As we become more connected, we create dependencies and interdependencies. So therefore, what used to be local shocks now cascade in far more disruptive ways. And that's why we really have to get out in front of this risk. Otherwise, the other downside of it, we disconnect, we disengage, because we think the risk is too great. And other examples here, we're embracing this whole Internet of Things. We're now close to this $26 billion, billion connections. Now your toaster talks to your refrigerator, that talks to your smartphone. Hurrah! Every time I make a connection, I also create a dependency, and I create potential vulnerability. And we're rushing ahead making connections, often without thinking about risk. And that's something why resilience is so key, is because we've got to get out in front of that. This is the other phenomena here. We built everything as separate projects. You know, we need water, so let's build a water plant here. Oh, we need power, so let's build a substation. Need transit, so let's put a road up and so forth. They're all now interconnected. So if I lose one, I impact on the other. And so again, when I have a climate event, it takes out power, as it did in Puerto Rico. The consequence is, along this line, if I have no power, I have no water because I need power to work pumps and wells. I have no power, I can't communicate because my telecommunications depend on electricity. I need diesel fuel in order to feed a generator, but I have no transport. Then I can't move the diesel fuel, so even the generators die down here. That impacts on healthcare that need even those backup generators and so forth, right? this hyper-connectedness, interdependency issue is something that really means we are at a greater risk for climate, not just because of what's happening in the natural systems, because the natural systems are impacting on our built systems, the way we live and where we live, in ways that are far more costly and disruptive. There's another reality that's kind of captured here is we're seeing the phenomena, of course, with wildfires. It's not just that there are wildfires. Always have been wildfires. We know with climate change they're happening with more frequency, so getting more intensity. The problem is they're impacting on the built environment because we're building in wild spaces that we used to not inhabit. You know, right now, guaranteed, there is a blizzard underway in Antarctica. Anybody losing sleep over that? Right? They're not there. There's not impact there. All right? But when you bring it to a place where a lot of people live, where you depend, so we have this combined issue. We built into an area where there's exposure, and now the exposure in turn is also creeping in on what we built. And that constant sort of, what we call this wildland-urban interface challenge. And as it played out, of course, with the campfire, the total destruction of a city, 18,000 structures destroyed. But also, the electric, the main utility in California also since we had such economic losses that declared bankruptcy. And some of you already saw this summer what a clumsy new approach is. We'll just turn off the power every time there's a fire. I mean, overstating that, but that's kind of the solution right now. We'll put a kill switch, turn it all down. That has guaranteed lots of consequences when you lose power, especially for vulnerable populations. So this is the kind of exposure we all share, because not just of climate, but because of how we build and operate in that climate. Okay, part of the other challenge is how to deal with what I call this phenomenon. This is a story of actually of the one prepared company that's very well heeled. It's Goldman Sachs. And shortly before Superstorm Sandy arrived at Lower Manhattan, since they're directly adjacent to the Hudson River, they did this brilliant thing. They want to get sandbags. Put them 50 feet high, surround it around the building. There's sand. They could have been cash, but Goldman went with sand, okay? And eureka! There it is. The one well-lit, dry building, Lower Manhattan. Just missing one thing. No employees. It turns out Goldman Sachs makes zero money by having a well-lit, dry building. It's dependent on all the other systems that are around it, and the employees couldn't get there. They had a plan for telecommuting. That storm basically knocked down the power grid around the surrounding areas. You can start to see the challenges here. You focus on an asset and say, we're going to get this right, but you don't look at the ecosystem around you, both the built and natural. Everybody's exposed. Even the most well-heeled, most sophisticated risk player virtually in the world basically wasn't prepared for something like a hurricane from a standpoint of its business. So how do we get to where we need all? This is my other new poster child. This went viral a year ago. The one house left standing in Mexico Beach, Florida, after Hurricane Michael. All around you see slab, and you can't see slab a little bit in here because the sand has overcome the slab. Those were all houses before Hurricane Michael. That house had damage to its bathroom window in the rear. The estimates are it's made about 5% more by putting these best practices in place to ride out the storm. And the storm was close to Category 5. I used to say, we know how to do this? We don't. Right? I mean, we can keep developing the how-to, but if we're not adopting these practices, then we just get cool pictures like this that don't make a whole lot of sense. So what's keeping us from becoming resilient? It really is these 5 barriers that are key to what we think about also an element of this workshop, this class is doing. Addressing particularly the first one. I can't get you to be resilient if you're risk illiterate. If you think nothing's ever going to happen, you never have a bump in the night, everything's going to happen to somebody else. We know this thing can happen, it won't happen to me. It won't impact on me. It won't impact on my family. So yeah, somebody's worried about this. That's why we pay emergency managers and police and the army or whatever the heck it is. But it doesn't affect me. The risk illiteracy is not just understanding the hazard, the kinds of things you already understand now about climate change, how real it is, what's driving it, but how it will play out on things we value. Understanding those connections are key to go, I might need to do something about this. So now I understand we don't design for resilience, we design for efficiency. That's the story I tell you. Connect everything. Centralize everything. Well, what happens though when we have a big bang, we get then big disruption? Because it turns out these very, essentially hub and spoke systems are quite fragile if you lose a hub. So we got to think in different ways about how we design in this environment that we're in. And that's not how the current economics work very well. We want to centralize, and that's a problem. Okay, now though, if I come up with good designs, we get the problem, nobody's got an incentive to adopt them. That's kind of my story of the house. Okay, now we get that. Then we also have the problem, we're not organized for any of this. As Ted was laying out the outset, the government wants to do something in New Hampshire or Maine or, nah. Well, how do you actually take a watershed that sprawls across states and come up with a system approach if you can't organize around it? A lot of our power, good news essentially on the power generation side, for Boston comes from Hydro-Quebec. Okay, that's good. Hydraulic, energy, great. But how do I basically assure that against a hazard? I have to talk to Canadians, which doesn't work if you put a wall up between, by the way, your neighbor, if you need the stuff that's on the other side. And then we're not training or educating, except here, we're doing that. So in that context, I have to make a case. And one of the cases here, again, is, of course, this incentive. And part of the way we talk energy, communicating, health, public safety. It's a function, basically. And if I lose it with the disruption A, and it takes me a while to respond B, and recover C, all that's lost. So let's imagine a world where we actually are resilient. We can withstand, this is to the left, so I don't lose much. I'm nimble in the response, and when I come back, I don't just come back to where I was before. I go, oh, this is an opportunity to build back better and smarter. And we plan for this. Now, what we actually do in the U.S. is the second one here. We don't bother that mitigation stuff, but we're good at responding. And just the way it was before. We just put everything the way back it was before. Never happened again. And then the other one is you have plans for making something never happen, like Deep on Horizon, but then you have no plan when it does. So it's this long, drawn-out process. What unfortunately we are for most small, medium companies and communities is what you see on the right, which is not only do they get knocked down bad, but they never get back up, totally. Right? People who have a choice leave. This is a problem in Puerto Rico. The brain drain. I mean, if you just can't get back, people leave. You never get to where you were before. So these are core elements of how we go forward. So when we think about this, what do? Well, part of what we need to think about is market-based incentives, as well as regulatory ones. But here, insurance can play a pretty important role. They send us signals all the time. That airbag I talked about. Got people adopted initially because the insurers gave you a break on your insurance if you had a car with one. And that started to create the demand for more people to have cars with them. To a point here, then you sort of ruled out it's all required. There's a way you can ease into this in other ways by using the market sort of signals to get you to a tipping point where you suddenly get this is the norm, and the norm then is adopted by a rule. Right? We also can look at financing. Financing should impact on if I invest in something, it's going to blow away in a year or two. But most of our financials is often sit on transactions where we transfer risk very quickly. We do the deal, give it to somebody else. But if we actually are looking at financing the totality of our investments, then we start to figure out how there can be ways to calculate this in. And for long-term investors, bonds and so forth, especially by social impact investors, this can be an audience for helping to drive some of these changes. The other is, and I think we've heard a little bit more of this, but we should bake it into our designs. This is a cool concept here that ideally would have happened, but didn't in our inundation district in Boston. So of course we built out the harbor a little bit above sea level. Okay. But imagine if we built it where all the first floors virtually are open atriums, like an open park. And if the water does come in as a night, it goes up again. That's right. I mean, we could think about design, not to say we're going to move decamp from Boston, move it inland, but we can think about how we coexist with the risk in a way that actually could make it a better place. These are possible if we ignite our innovation, our energy around how we manage risk better. Okay, the other is you get anchor institutions like this one, which I spent some time also harassing on this, but we have anchor institutions that are also in ability to not just fix their own stuff. This goes back to my Goldman Sachs example. It doesn't do them a lot of good if they themselves alone are okay, because they're dependent on the community around them. So let's start harnessing that. Let's go to the major universities. Let's go to the major medical centers, go to the major, and say, you gotta be a responsible neighbor. Not just get your own act together, but help the neighborhood around you. Build this capacity. Model. You all have social missions. Exercise that. And this is an area in which we can essentially, potentially scale solutions relatively quickly. So I'm going to conclude, oh, the other one here, my other slogan, a disaster is a terrible thing to waste. There is actually $140 billion in unspent federal disaster assistance out there right now, which is a crime unto itself. Some of it dates back to New Orleans, okay, and Katrina. Well, we can leverage those dollars to every time we use it to build better and smarter. But we have to find what that is in advance. We have to know what those plans are. And then we can use these dollars as effect. But then we take further, grant money, whenever we basically spend money on economic development, we should be using it to say, hey, be in a better place. That's what we want to invest in. So there's lots of areas for us to look. So to conclude here is that it's increasingly can be argued, and this is the way I think you need to shift the conversation to some extent. Adapting to climate change, and part here is a competitiveness issue. If you're not, you're screwed. All right? And then people have a choice, companies have a choice, will leave those places that are vulnerable and not resilient, and gravitate to those who are. There's no hazard-free place on the planet, but the ones that are really managing well, that's where I want to live. That's where I want to invest. That's where I want to belong. And so, as we start talking about this as something in that way, the other point here is that companies who embed this here tend to win these disruptions. They end up getting market share. So it's smart. The resilience measures are also helpful for communities to bounce back quicker and smarter. We have to really help that because, again, then you don't lose population, you don't lose small businesses. These are all things that are critical to a community coming back. That resilience measures are more affordable and effective if they're built in. I use the example like a handicapped accessible home. All right, trying to take a raised ranch home and convert it into handicapped accessible, not pretty, not very functional, and expensive. Bake it into the design of the home, and it's efficient, low cost, and it works. So this is the kind of thinking we need to talk about, embedding. And last, we need the first movers who know this best practice, them, and so this can be something we export. And so I know I tilted heavily on the economics here, but I want to raise this because we are very polarized around this issue. And if we can find inventive ways, creative ways to shift the conversation, or at least broaden the conversation to include these kinds of concepts and ideas, my hope is we can start to get that critical mass, that movement towards a better place. And so being open to them as the possibilities is something I want to share. There's going to be a lot of other brilliance coming at you shortly. I'm going to hand the microphone over now.
That was a reference to the next two speakers, not me. So thank you. Thank you, Ted and team, for inviting me here. Pleasure to be back in Northeastern. My name is Brian Swett. I work for a firm called Arup. We're a global design, engineering, and consulting firm with offices here in Boston, New York, throughout the U.S. and North America. Our most significant office is in London. We're in 95 offices around the world in 30 different countries. I have the privilege of serving as their Boston office leader. We've got about 100 folks here in Boston, about 1,600 in the Americas, and I also serve as the Americas Director of Cities and Sustainable Real Estate. Prior to that, you'll understand that prior to that context, when we get into my slides, I was the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston for the final few years of the Menino administration and the beginning of the Walsh administration. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Boston context and story. You'll see a lot of similarities to the themes that Steve touched on, but with a different lens and different examples. So I think we're moving in similar directions. There's some differences, but I think I'll bring a private sector lens to this conversation with an orientation towards the built environment. So, with that said, a slightly different definition of resilience, and I think the things I'd note here is we define it sort of by sector, but cities are made up of businesses, systems, institutions, communities, individuals. I know later on we're going to hear about how human-centered resilience is really a key part of this. Not thinking about it as buildings being resilient. What we actually care about at the end of the day is our well-being, is our livelihoods, is how we're connected as a community. And it's not sufficient to talk about surviving and adapting. We have to talk about thriving in this new world because change is the new norm, and extreme weather is the new norm. And so we can't talk about just surviving day in and day out. That's not a healthy, sustainable, exciting, fun place to be. We need to talk about how we thrive given these changing conditions. So to put climate change in context, and we also have a broad-scale resilience practice at Europe, not just around natural hazards, but also around man-made hazards, and how do we be resilient in the case of all sorts of different shocks and stresses to our systems. So climate change is obviously the #1 disruptor systematically across the world today. but it is exacerbated, and the impacts of climate change are exacerbated from a resilience perspective from our massive aging infrastructure in this country and around the world, massively underinvested, billions of dollars that we should have spent a while ago on reinvesting our infrastructure. That the silver lining of this, and I'll talk about how we design differently, is hopefully when we do invest those dollars, we're investing it smarter in the standpoint of preparing that infrastructure for its future expected environmental conditions, not its past. If we had invested those dollars in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we would have invested it incorrectly. So the silver lining to our aging infrastructure is that we now need to spend that money the right way. Security threats exacerbate, so the stresses, both shocks and stresses of climate change are exacerbated by security threats, and those are a double-edged, those go both ways. There's a lot of writing now being done in academia and otherwise on international relations on climate change-related stresses and the resulting in civil conflict in places like Syria, where the drought and the famine that resulted was certainly an exacerbating factor into the civil conflict in Syria. Resource constraints, climate change is exacerbating our resource constraints economically in both developed and developing world. You had mentioned, Steve, supply chain vulnerability, which is exacerbated by our interconnection. And oftentimes there's a critical part that still has a limited amount of resources. And we saw that during the tsunamis in Japan and in Taiwan, when there were critical automotive parts that had a ripple effect throughout the supply chain for several quarters. And then technology. Technology is both part of the solution, but part of the challenge. We experienced, both Atyia and I experienced in Boston dealing with natural disasters, our reliance on cell phone towers. We're breaking out the hand wave radios when the power goes down. And when the cell phone towers are inundated because everybody else is trying to use them, you need a way of emergency responders communicating themselves that is off of the IoT. So there's some value there and there's some challenges there. We think about multi-hazard assessments, and most of our clients in the private sector space aren't just thinking about climate change risk, they're thinking about both man-made and natural issues and events and stresses, how it impacts their buildings, how it impacts their operations, how it impacts their clients, and they want to think across the spectrum of asset protection, disruption time, to reputation, life safety, as well as operations. And it is a full story. Your suite of solutions first gets defined by how you look at the problem. So some examples of tackling that. We had the privilege of being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation before the 100 Resilient Cities program to really define resilience globally from a city's perspective. So we were hired to, and all of this is public IP, so you're welcome to look at it and download it. Something called the City Resilience Index, which was really, it was the first comprehensive tool to look across the spectrum of resilience largely, not just climate change. And I always highlight to folks that the actual physical risk, when we talk about infrastructure and ecosystems, which is oftentimes what dominates the news, for us was only 25% of the issue, right? Is that we wanted to understand the impacts of leadership and strategy, the economy and society and connective tissue, and equally important, the human-centered aspects of resilience. Developed methodologies and approaches, as well as metrics. There are 156 metrics of resilience relevant to cities to gauge where you stand as a tool. And Boston is one of the cities that went through this process, and as a tool to baseline where you stand, where you're strong, where you're relatively weak and need improvement, and then plan for reducing your risk and increasing your resilience. On the back of that, how many folks have heard of the 100 Resilient Cities program? That's interesting. That's pretty good. Rockefeller would be happy. So they funded a program with a massive amount of resources and attention. They funded 100 chief resilience officers in cities around the country, including the Hood one later, and resilient cities strategies. And Arup had the privilege of developing about 22 of those strategies around the world. By and large, the program was very successful at initiating a newfound step change in appreciation of the need for resilience as a topic in Boston, say on the 5th floor, but in mayor's offices around the world. That this wasn't just something for an emergency response approach, it wasn't just something from a public works approach. There need to be comprehensive resilience planning and strategies. If we're going to be successful, it would Steve to talk about changing our operating procedures. And then later on, we had the privilege of working with the Lloyd's Register Foundation on a project called the Resilient Shift. Because one of the things we learned we were founded in 1946 by Arup, is that design matters, and you need to design things for the full life of the useful asset. And so we were not facing standards in the marketplace in terms of specs from infrastructure owners and funders and delivery folks. To be able to build that way. There needs to be a shift in resilience and a shift in infrastructure. And so we have been funded as a collaborative effort where we both do some of the work and issue a lot of grants to others to be able to change how infrastructure is perceived, how we design it, and what are the standards so that it is prepared for the next century, not the last century. So that was just some context. I'm going to quickly walk through some of the drivers of extreme weather and climate change driven drivers, because this sets the context for how we respond. And these will be supportive of steep slides. This was just updated at the end of 2019. The last decade, we saw $800 billion in hard cost expenses. This is not operating losses. This is not the economic disruption that we talked about. $800 billion in the last 10 years. And that is from wildfires, from hurricanes, from flooding events, from hailstorms, a massive amount of resources that we're spending rebuilding things that if we had spent money correctly up front, 8 to 1 is even a better factor. Would be 6 to 1 is the ratio of sort of pre-mitigation spending to what you can save down the line. It is massive. We are spending bad money after avoiding spending good money to massive factors. And these places, and I completely agree with Steve's point, these places sometimes never bounce back. New Orleans will never be the city it was pre-Katrina in terms of population. The folks who moved to Texas, by and large, they are staying there, not coming back. That is a very different city going forward, not because of some strategic plan or decision that they made as a city, but because of some massive disruptive event that we weren't prepared for, that they weren't prepared for. Extreme heat, and I think we're going to hear some more about that, but the hurricanes and the storms and the winter storms get a disproportionate amount of the attention around the world from a human perspective. Extreme heat is the largest natural disaster cause of death in the world, year in, year out. And it happens because it's usually the most vulnerable populations that are impacted by this. So it's the young, it's the elderly, it's those who can't afford air conditioning. And it happens oftentimes over periods of days and weeks of extreme heat. And folks may remember Chicago a number of years back, France a couple of years ago. These are underappreciated as things we need to prepare for, and they're highly predictive in that we know we're going to be facing a lot more of these going forward. And we actually know which regions of the world we're going to be facing extreme heat going forward. The real estate industry paying attention. The report on the left was an international report that Urban Land Institute produced. Again, all this is public, and you can find these well worth skimming through, called SCORCH, which is the real estate industry's response to extreme heat. The systems in which we design our buildings are designed for certain ambient temperatures outside. And when that starts to change rapidly, the buildings themselves start to change and how we can function in them. And then Living with Heat was a phenomenal piece of work that Urban Land Institute in Boston produced and looked at 5 neighborhoods in the Boston area and recommended solutions to be thought about for solving extreme heat going forward in Greater Boston, because that is one of the issues we're facing with. And that's a great resource as well to think about solutions. So this is probably the scariest slide that I have in there, and then we'll start transitioning to sort of some market drivers and where we go. Union of Concerned Scientists, which is just based in Cambridge, produced a phenomenal piece of work that said maybe we're focusing, even from a flooding perspective, on the wrong risk. We spend a lot of time talking about hurricane risk. Are we talking about chronic inundation? And they define chronic inundation as the every other week high tide flooding. So every other week there's water lapping above your property line, right? And they define the communities that are impacted by it, saying if 10% of your built environment, so not your marshland, not your parks and open space, if 10% of your built environment, your roads and buildings is impacted every other week, that's going to have a continuously stressful disruptor effect on your community. So the map on the left is homes at risk of inundation in 2045, and I want to get the stats exactly right. So more than 300,000 coastal homes today with a collective market value of $100 billion are at risk of chronic inundation in 2045. Seems like a long way away. That is well within the life of a 30-year mortgage today. So we should be underwriting that risk today. We are not. Approximately 14,000 coastal commercial properties with an assessed value of another $19 billion, also in that 2045 map. Together, they house about 550,000 people that we need to think about being sort of climate refugees within the next 30 years, or needing solutions to allow them to continue to live in a situation where it's the twice a day high tide. It's not the flooding event that you have a 1% storm. This is predicted flooding in neighborhoods. And they produce a tax basis contribution to their communities of $1.5 billion. So that's the hard part about managed retreat, is that these are communities from an organizational structure in municipalities that may not be functional from a tax basis as it starts to move backwards. The situation obviously does not get better when you look at 2100. 2100, you're talking about $1 trillion at risk across 2.4 million homes. The homes in LA and Houston alone collectively have a $912 billion value risk to the every other week high tide in those communities. And in terms of property value It's $12 billion in property tax base going back to those communities, and 4.7 million people living in places that are at risk at the end of the century. And many of those people are alive right now. And so that is a massive disruption. When you look at a state like the state of Florida, that's in 2100, that's 10% of the residential houses in 2100. So this is not something that we can deal with at a city scale. This is not something that we deal with at a state scale. This is a national crisis that needs an organization and response at that scale. And all that is public and available. All right, so market drivers, very quickly in terms of the economic drivers that we see here, which I think you'll see some similarities to what Steve presented. CRAFT is the Climate Risk and Adaptation Framework and Taxonomy. So it is a mouthful. I think it's a name searching for an acronym. But we developed for the Compact of Mayors, which is a global group of cities who are reporting on both their risk and then their response to and their planning for that risk. So these are hundreds of cities around the world saying, we get it, you've got our attention, we were on a report in a common format about where we stand in being able to respond to climate risk. The Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, TCFD, is a Bloomberg-led initiative which is getting great traction, and it's basically the response from underwriters and investors and bond agencies saying, we need more information about our investments in terms of the climate risk that is embedded in those investments. It is not just private sector publicly traded companies they're looking at municipal bonds. So you're going to start to say, how do cities respond to the TCFD requirements so that they can underwrite their capital bonds? And when you talk about the grade of the bonds, no longer is it saying we have this great tax base, we have this much infrastructure that's in relatively good repair. The question is going to be, here's your projected climate impact. How are you responding to it? And that should impact our appreciation of the risk of our investment if it's a 30-year investment for a bond in a community like Boston or Miami. This is a snapshot of the letter from the CEO of BlackRock. I don't know if folks caught that last week. This is sort of, I feel two different ways about this. One is it's about time, right? There's nothing particularly profound in Flynn's letter. The second part is this is massively important because this is not a first mover financial institution. This is an institution that provides a lot of political cover for a lot of more conservative institutions that are looking to squeeze the market in a near-term perspective, potentially at the cost of the long term. And this is now BlackRock saying this is a game changer and it will likely impact financial markets sooner than people appreciate now. So really important, nothing profound in terms of, we didn't already know this, but it's very important who's saying it and how they're saying it. And then lastly, CLF. So for a firm like us, we understand the challenges, we understand the science of climate change, we understand the engineering solutions. Who's at risk? We're not designing the right solutions going forward. It turns out the code doesn't protect design firms. And so we are required to constitute best professional judgment in our decisions. So once we know the risk, we don't have the defense that ignorance is bliss anymore, right? And so even if the code says, you only need to design to this standard, if we feel like that is not protected, it's not best professional practice, we are liable. So it's a really interesting piece from the Conservation Law Foundation on the liability of climate risk, which will be a massive driver in change in terms of how we appreciate it. So very quickly, the Boston story. The map on the left, 1630. We know that we're built largely on filled tidelands, lots of portions of Boston. The map on the right is 2070 do-nothing scenario for climate change. So the ocean will take back the land that we took from it several hundred years ago as our business as usual scenario. Why is that important? Superstorm Sandy, we talked about, I love the quote of, don't miss out on leveraging any disaster, right? So Superstorm Sandy hit literally 2 months after I took office in the Menino administration. Folks said, weren't we lucky it hit 500 miles further south? The reality is that storm was so massive, it was 1,000 miles across, that we, if it had hit at our high tide, same direct hit in New York, but at our high tide, which was 5 hours earlier, we would have had a 100-year flooding event in Boston. From nowhere near a direct hit. We were very, very lucky. Since I left, and I served for about 2.5, 3 years in government, during that 2.5, 3 years after Sandy, there were 5 additional near misses of 100-year flooding events by a sum total of 20 hours. There's a reason we now have a casino in Boston, because we've been rolling the dice. So the actual flooding from Superstorm Sandy is on the left, and they're very localized. They made a lot of pictures, and that was because, again, it was off our high tide. If it had hit, if it had hit at high tide, these are the areas that would have been impacted. That's roughly mean high water in 2070. Right? These are the areas, so this is what 5-hour difference looks like in terms of the impacted area. Sandy hitting in 2050 is mean high water in 2100. That's Boston being taken out by a storm. All right, so when we talked about living with water, and you may have seen images of canals going down Back Bay, that's because the do nothing scenario, that's not tomorrow, but the do nothing scenario for buildings that we are permitting and approving today is that scenario, if we choose to do nothing. To make matters more fun, the federal government is not exactly encouraging better behavior in the built environment. So the FEMA flood maps actually do not take climate change into account. They are based on the flooding events that you have had in your locality, the worst of those, and what constitutes that 1% storm. Fortunately, in Boston, we pushed it a bit, and our natural hazard mitigation planning does take into account climate change, but the maps on which folks are required to buy insurance looking forward 30 years do not. They look at last year's storm at best. So functionally, we have significant challenges in the system to even get this right. So in Boston, we wanted to move forward. We used that as a fulcrum point for us to actually have a step change in the conversation, both within City Hall and government and externally with the private sector. There's been a number of plans that are out there and encourage folks to take a look at them, getting down to both overall strategies as well as neighborhood scale plans. And again, our climate projections, which are now getting more and more refined, and every time I look at them, they get worse and worse from where they're going, are fairly well detailed. So we can understand this to a significant degree. The one I'd highlight in this is in 2070, the do nothing scenario is 90 days a year over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. In New England, from a health perspective, and in New England, we usually have 1 or 2 of these a summer. More than 3 days above 90 is considered a heat wave, where we tell folks you gotta be careful, stay indoors, you're not outside playing. 90 is your entire summer as a heat wave. That's very different than we've experienced up here in the life of Boston as a city with people in it. And the storms keep coming. These are just snapshots from Northeasters in 2018. I love to say, Sandy was an aberration not just for the scale of it, but when it hit in Boston, we're far more likely to have a major flooding event happen in the wintertime, where you get the exacerbating effect of snow and ice covering your storm drains. So it becomes a lot harder to deal with the floodwater in the lower left and the floodwater around Aquarium because the storm drains cannot convey it out. You're waiting for the tides to recede, and then you got to break up the storm drains, break up the ice around the storm drains. So responses to climate risk. So now we're turning to the positive. We need to look at scale and connectivity. So very similar to what Steve said: buildings, neighborhoods, cities, infrastructure, utilities. It all matters. This is that, like the game show is around for a little while. The weakest link. The weakest link is the thing that is going to take down whether or not your building is operating. Similar to the picture in Manhattan. Our approach is we talk to clients about what is their desires for resilience. What's their time frame? Are they looking at 2050, 2070? What types of impacts and storms do they want? And what do they want to be during the storm? Is it a shutter it down and don't go into work, and then you can come back and you just want to limit your damage? Or are you a hospital and you need to be open and operating and fully functioning in the midst of the storm? That changes how we look at things. We have the details. This is a tool that Arup developed a number of years ago to do very downskilled modeling, which is really important on the impacts of climate change. We can take all of the different comp scenarios and say, what are the impacts of precipitation down to your zip code? And we can then say, okay, is this critical bridge designed to deal with this impact of deluge, of rain hitting within an hour, so that it's still operating, or is it flooded out during the middle of a storm, and then you have a connectivity issue? So we can now design for that. The science is there and the data is there. We know what resilient office buildings, what resilient residential buildings can look like. To Steve's point, we know what the solution is from an engineering design perspective. It's about implementing it, in particular with existing buildings. And we have successful stories. So this is another one where very low cost, Spalding Rehab. I'd encourage folks, if you haven't been there, it's a phenomenal example of probably still the most resilient medical facility in the country, certainly in New England. Designed in the context of Hurricane Katrina. For all of this, which included hardwiring the high voltage duct up to the roof and doing the transformer up there, operable windows, a great landscape that prevents any direct access from flooding, was roughly less than 1% of hard costs. Additional hard costs of what they would have done otherwise. You talk about the 6 to 1, 8 to 1, this is a 20 to 1 investment. Right? You can never evacuate a hospital in New England anymore because we don't have the extra beds. It is a significant disruption to say, can you investigate a 250, can you evacuate a 250 patient hospital and find somewhere else for them to go that is safe and they can be cared for? That is a stress on our health system that we're not designed to handle. Partners learned from that experience and design said, well, wait a second, we own a lot of other hospitals, we own a lot of other assets, how do we apply this knowledge elsewhere? We've been working with them since then at Arup on identifying all 30 of their sites in New England. What are the climate risks? What do they need to do about it? They're one of the most advanced and thoughtful healthcare institutions in the country thinking about this. The city of Somerville we work with on their climate change vulnerability assessment, looking not only at flooding, but in particular at heat. One of their concerns is a lot of their citizens use mass transit, use bike lanes, use buses. Well, is that attractive when you have 90 days summer over 90 degrees heat? How do you start preparing for cooling centers? How do you start saying how do folks use bike lanes when it's extremely hot out? How do we design for that? People saw pictures of the MTA down in New York being flooded out. Boston's is just similarly at risk, and we have an even older system. So this is a picture from one of those 2018 storms of our common solution set around Aquarium T-stop. Works for a certain type of storm, has a limit to it. We actually had the privilege of working with MTA in New York on more engineered solutions. MBTA is getting on top of this here in Boston, understands the blue line, the orange line, certain lines need to be prioritized as we begin the massive investment in repairing the system. We need to make sure it also is protected for its future climate. And then lastly, existing buildings and new buildings, we know what needs to be done. And we can assign consequent ratings, we can do the engineering solutions. This is from a study of an existing building asset assessment in the Seaport to say what does it mean for that asset to be ready and available and for new construction. This is actually rebuilding of a building down in the Seaport on a marina and on a wharf that was designed for a certain water elevation. But the fun part is not only are you concerned about water going over the wharf and the seawall, but the pressure of water coming up is not something that was designed for structurally. So you can picture the force that a major wave has during a hurricane event, pushing up on a slab and saying, wait a second, is everything tied down? So the solutions are out there to conclude. I'm looking forward to the panel to a significant degree to talk about how we get to those solutions. And thank you for having me.
All right. Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Good? It is on. Mic check, 1, 2. Okay, there we go. All right. So good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I am so happy to be here with you. My name is Dr. Atyia Martin, and I am the CEO and founder of All ACEs, Inc. We are an organization that partners with other organizations on understanding what racism is, how it works, how it's impacting their employees and the people that they serve, whether it's through products and services, as well as, and most importantly, what we can do proactively in order to advance racial equity. Right? And we do that through a resilience lens. That's crazy talk, right? Like here I go again, connecting the dots between things that most people don't connect the dots between, right? So for folks who have heard me speak before, I was the former Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston. I was the first Chief Resilience Officer. And what was so unique about our approach was that we looked at how racism impacts the current state of affairs in a way that changed the narrative about how we talk about what racism is and how it works, but also where there are opportunities for us to embed racial equity in how we take different approaches to resilience, right? Whether we think about it from an economic perspective, whether we think about it from an infrastructure perspective, environmental, or social, right? And that social resilience is the same as actually advancing racial equity. Those are two different things. And what's interesting about that too is that when we look at how we advance racial equity in the context of any of the challenges that we face, whether it's as individuals, within organizations, communities, across entire cities, we have this huge opportunity because it's really not as hard as we think it is. It's really not as hard as we think it is. And the reason why it's not as hard as we think it is because, or the reason we think it's so hard rather, is because we don't really talk about racism because it's too icky and uncomfortable, right? And we're not even all on the same page about what it is and how it works. And so there are these huge opportunities to connect the dots with how we navigate as individuals within our lives, personal lives, how we navigate as individuals professionally, and how we navigate as professionals collectively within institutions in terms of how we think about policy, practice, and culture. I say all of that to land here, which is I am going to walk through the connection between climate change resilience and racism and racial equity so that we can have a more sophisticated conversation about approaches to how we address issues of climate change, and that we're doing it in a way where we're not perpetuating inequities. Because what I have learned throughout my career, and what all of the nerds say, and I consider myself a nerd as well, is these opportunities that we have to advance racial equity, the challenges that we have to face when it comes to racism, are actually very much tied to the outcomes, the negative outcomes that we see after disasters. Very much so. The research is very clear about this. The research is also very clear about the fact that when we do not embed equity into the work that we do, it doesn't happen. Shocker. Let me say that again. When we do not embed equity, social equity, into the work that we do, whether it's in our individual lives or in organizations or across cities and communities, it does not happen because we default to what we usually do. So, that being said, I am going to say one more thing about myself, which is the most important thing about me, which is my husband and I have 5 children, 2 still at home, and 2 grandbabies. So this work for me, in the biggest ways that I've learned about racism, racial equity, and resilience, is actually from being a parent. I'll just be straightforward with you. I mean, you can question my psychological standing later in terms of why we even have 5 children. That's a whole other question. We'll deal with that later. So that's my team is making me do this more. That's all my contact information stuff. You can take a picture. I have it at the end as well. And really for us, I'm trying to do better at this stuff. So there's the stuff that I'm supposed to do. You all are all my witnesses for my staff that I did this. That happened. And I'm gonna change it in 3, 2, 1. And so as an organization, what we do in terms of our mission is to activate consciousness, catalyze critical thinking, and transform capabilities that help people and organizations to advance racial equity and build resilience in order to be able to keep doing it. Now, let me talk a little bit about how I talk about resilience. What I've learned is that resilience actually has 2 layers to it that are very distinct. One is all the stuff we've seen before, right? Our ability to adapt, to thrive in spite of all of the stuff coming at us, right? And we talked about mitigation as being one of those ways that we can reduce the amount of stuff coming at us. I want to sit there and I want to pull that piece out a little bit because that's the second half that we don't spend enough time on, which is our agency. Our ability as individuals in our own lives, our abilities as collective people in groups and communities and organizations to actually do a lot to impact climate change and other huge problems that we face in our society, right? That distributive agency that exists is really powerful in ways that we don't realize, and I'm gonna tell a little bit later. This is the stuff we do as an organization, but here is the fun part. Very quickly, I want you to tell me which dot has the most colors. 3, 2, 1. Red, blue, or white? Okay, you would be wrong. Right? We call these humility exercises. They remind us as human beings that we're just people and we fall into all types of potholes as we're navigating in life, right? Whether it's dealing with our own stuff personally or whether it's dealing with big problems like climate change and advancing racial equity and all of these other big challenges that we face. In fact, as people, more often than not, we fall into these traps on a regular basis when we are not paying attention and when we don't have strategies to manage the fact that we do this stuff. And this is how, when we are working on climate change and other challenges, we perpetuate inequities without meaning to do so. This is how it works. Let me keep going. So let's talk about resilience and social vulnerability. One of the things that's really fascinating to me is we love to talk about the stuff on your left, right? We love talking about this stuff when it comes to resilience and all the stuff we're gonna do. And then there's like people over there. But like, yeah, and then there's like these people, like, you know, there's people. But like the stuff, we love to live in the stuff. And there's a reason why, because it's easier to think about. Even as hard as that is, it's just easier to wrap our brains around. So we tend to spend most of our energy on this side. Now, the challenge for us is how do we connect the dots between what was referenced earlier as a human-centered approach? The fact that we as human beings collectively are actually the ones on the receiving end of this. And when we don't understand the social dynamics that are impacting the way things exist before we even consider climate change, it makes it harder for us to then think about this whole, the big picture people stuff, right? Or I should say the nuances of the people challenges. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is nerdy stuff that helped me to look at who are the most socially vulnerable people in our society, right? So linked analysis, going through a bunch of research to see who are they talking about in the research and how are they connecting the dots between different groups of people. Some more nerdy stuff, and then what happens after disasters. Way up here, post-incident, what are the impacts of these disasters, right, on real people, particularly the most vulnerable? And then here's where we land. So after all of that nerdiness, shaking me up and doing statistical gyrations, I landed here, these are the categories of people who are most socially vulnerable in terms of the connections they have, in terms of the likelihood of having multiple categories they fall into in terms of social vulnerability, because that's what makes you more vulnerable as a human being. The more categories you fall into, the more likely you are to be most vulnerable. And these 7 categories are the ones that connect most to all the other categories you saw on that crazy chart, but they're also connected very closely with each other. And the 3 in the middle here, social isolation, low to no income, and people of color, are the 3 that are most connected to everything and directly connected to poor outcomes after disasters. And those are displacement, meaning I can't go back to my home. We heard that in Katrina, when people left to go to Texas, never came back. They were displaced, and all of them did not choose to stay in Texas. So I just want to be clear about that. People moved to Texas because they had to and couldn't come back. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other piece is access to services. So post-disaster services that we as government at the local, state, and federal level offer people, they're more likely to not get what they need from those services because of everything from historical context and where those services get located, how those services are structured in terms of who homeowners is a renter, right? As well as how much money you can then get depending on which categories you fall into, and whether or not that actually makes you whole again. Injury or illness or death, property damage and loss, domestic violence, not because people are more prone to violence, but because of all of these other pressures going on that puts pressures on real people and their families, and loss of employment. So all of these factors are more likely to happen to people who fall into these categories when we talk about post-disaster. That doesn't mean everyone else doesn't experience these things. It means that they experience them at higher levels because of decisions we've made over a long period of time in society in terms of where people live, how they get treated, who gets access to what, who doesn't, where we place value, where we don't place value. That said, let's talk about Boston. So then I looked at the city of Boston and said, well, what do these categories look like in Boston? And it's fascinating. I won't get into this one, but I want to highlight these 3 because those 3 are the ones that are most connected to those post-disaster incidents, so those post-disaster outcomes, negative outcomes. And the 3 neighborhoods in the city of Boston where you see the highest concentration of those 3 categories, and let me clarify, social isolation is not a set of data you can get from the census. It's actually proxy data. And for us, me, myself, and I'm gonna do the research. Social isolation was proxy data that leverages 2 categories that are mutually exclusive. Single parent households, right, where the other parent doesn't live there, but there are kids, and households where older adults live alone. And those in the literature are 2 of the most vulnerable categories of people. That said, as we move forward, let's look at how this stuff maps out. So just to orient you, these maps, the redder the area on the map, the more statistically significantly concentrated this category of people are in that area. The darker the blue, the less statistically significantly concentrated people are in those areas. In other words, the highest concentration of people dealing with these issues living in the darkest, reddest areas. Doesn't mean that's the only places they live, that's just where they are most highly concentrated. So let's walk through this. I told you about this, right? This is older adults who live alone and single parent households. Low to no income, and you see this is slightly different. You get that little piece of East Boston here, right? That's where the housing the main housing developments are, and then you get this piece of Alston Brighton, same thing. And then you get these pieces in the South End, Back Bay area, same thing. Housing developments. Then we get to people with disabilities. This is the one I found most interesting. Highly statistically concentrated in these areas. Similar areas, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. You get that piece of South End and that piece of East Boston because of the housing development, because we generally pull everybody in different groups or in the same groups in one type of housing. Then we look at people of color. Where are they? Highly statistically concentrated in the same areas. Crazy, right? Now here's the interesting part. This is the thing that then blew me away even more than people with disabilities and even people of color, which is where are our children most highly statistically significantly concentrated in the city? Same areas. Now, if this doesn't motivate us to action, right, like we got work to do on ourselves just as people, right? This idea that our children are concentrated in these areas, and then when we look at the maps of risk from climate change. So there is actually some water impacts that are not necessarily associated with sea level rise, but more associated with the usual flooding that we get from rains and from riverine flooding, and sometimes because the harbor floods and for other reasons. But then, when you think about the heat, the urban heat island effect, this is where it's most concentrated in these areas right here. And that's where we have the most vulnerable populations. If we are not being honest about the fact that this is a real thing for us to be including in our plans, and if you notice a lot of the maps that talk about the city of Boston and where we need to focus on, they're kind of mostly like up here. They don't include down here usually. And that's fundamentally a problem because this isn't just about isolation, right? These are people who work. They get up and go to work every day. And they have to catch 2 buses to a train to get to work. And then do that all in reverse. To the same places that are located in this area right here. And so it's not a separate issue. This is where a good chunk of Boston's workforce lives. People who live in Boston generally work in Boston. So this isn't just a social challenge, it's an economic challenge, it's an environmental challenge, because when we look at the existing environmental issues already happening in communities, and then you layer climate change on top of that. These are the areas where you see the highest concentration of industries that use toxic chemicals and have them on their properties. Nail salons, auto body shops, auto mechanic shops, you see them highly concentrated in these neighborhoods. So flooding happens there, we have a problem on our hands. So here's where I'm gonna go next. Why? Now, there's lots of reasons why, and I'm picking one in particular because it's the hardest one for us to talk about, which I kind of alluded to. You can guess what is racism. And I'm recognizing that this is one form of many forms of oppression. This is the one that the research shows us is most interconnected with all the other different types of oppression, that if you are a person of color and fall into any of these other categories, life looks very different from you than the people who just fall into those other categories of oppression, right? So it becomes a multiplying factor of challenges in life for lots of different reasons, and not because of a problem with people, but because of a problem with us collectively in the decisions that we made and the opportunities that we haven't necessarily taken advantage of, because many of us don't know what those opportunities are, but there are plenty of them. So here's the definition we use, and I want to sit in a place of clarity. So I want to acknowledge that it's historically rooted. It's not a thing that just happened one day and today we have racism, right? There is a long history of policies, practices, and culture that we have in society that landed us to where we are today. And it's dehumanizing. There are a series of dehumanizing ideas about who people are and how they're supposed to be. Those ideas reinforce the concept of whiteness. And I don't mean white people, and I just want to be clear about that. This is not about bashing white people. Advancing racial equity is not about saving people of color or bashing white people. Advancing racial equity is actually about us acknowledging that we have been socialized in a certain way that actually detracts from our ability to see each other clearly, to see communities clearly so that we can make better decisions, so that we can see the connectedness and the struggles that we're facing and the opportunities that we have. And in fact, when we are distracted by who we think people are, who we think communities are, we actually make decisions that are bad for ourselves. So, and I'm not white. However, I'm just saying that white people make bad decisions that harm themselves because, I'm gonna try not to say we, because white people get distracted by these other things that other people show us. They say, oh, this issue, climate change and climate justice is about those people. It's not about you, it's about those people. So then decisions get made because the face of the issue is those people, and then it turns around and boomerang daggers white people. Let me give a concrete example and then I'm gonna move on to wrap up. Concrete example, I'm gonna use an example that has nothing to do with climate change, and I'm just going to say the shortest one, which is Affordable Care Act versus Obamacare. Remember that whole debate, right? People didn't know that that was the same thing, right? Obamacare was the stuff that those people have. I have the Affordable Care Act, right? Because that's how politicians were framing the issue, because it served their purposes. And we fell right into the trap. Lo and behold, they tried to take it away, and everyone was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You want to take away my Affordable Care Act? I thought you were talking about Obamacare, that stuff for those people. And here's the reality. Just as our infrastructure is interconnected and interdependent, so are we as people. There is no issue that only impacts one group of people. Pick an issue and we can have a debate around how it actually impacts more than the group of people, that the way we talk about it in the media and in common discourse is falsely reflecting. That said, the interesting piece here that I already alluded to is that racism actually is harmful to people of color in ways that we talk about all the time, but it's also harmful to white people too. I gave one example in terms of being distracted by the squirrel, the shiny thing, but there are other ways too that we don't have time to get into. Point being is, this is something that I hinted at, that bounded rationality. Anybody ever heard of this term, bounded rationality? Oh, they had some hands up, right? So you're doing stuff, so I won't make you say, did you put your hand up? Did I see you put your hand up? No, I just misread that, okay. Did you want to share? No, she doesn't want to share. She's like, I put her on the spot. So, that said, bounded rationality is actually fascinating, and this is really the biggest impact of racism. Right? Bounded rationality is this idea that when individuals make decisions, their ability to reason or be reasonable is limited by the complexity of the problem, the cognitive limitations of their minds. That includes cognitive bias, but it includes lots of other things. I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm fill in the blank. And the time available to make the decision leading to seeking a satisfactory solution rather than an optimal one. We do it all the time. This is why integrating people into the conversation is so hard for us to wrap our brains around, right? Because it's complicated. We have some cognitive challenges, not just in terms of bias, but also in terms of just our lack of historical knowledge around how we got to the inequities we see in communities today. Furthermore, it limits the world for us in an interesting way. So if we think of climate change being in this circle of concern, and we say climate change is this big thing that all of us should be afraid of, and there's all this data that says we should be scared, right? Then there's this circle of influence. There's things that I can actually impact as an individual, as an organization, as a community. And then there's the actual action, where we decide to place our energy. And where we decide to place our energy is very interestingly contracted when we're focused on all of the big scary stuff that is outside of our ability to impact, which actually is less than we think. But when we're focusing only on that stuff, what we can envision about our ability to act is very restricted. But if we are able to focus on this piece and say, okay, what can I do? What can my organization do? What can my community do? There's actually a level of agency that's really empowering in terms of being able to learn about these issues in the same way that you all are doing tonight, but also being able to take baby steps. We're not always gonna win, but if you talk to any activist who's been working in communities, you will find that the reason they keep doing it is because they've actually had some wins. And they've actually seen change in their community in powerful ways. And what's really interesting is when we are able to see it that way, our circle of action, the amount of action we take increases, and what we can influence increases. And then when we get together with other people, other communities, other groups, we can even have more impact. Now, why is this important? Because whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about racism, this actually applies. If you look at anything from psychology to sociology to the engineering side of things, in terms of process of change and what it looks similar to this actually. Now, we're going to end on an exercise in order to show how, again, this is a humility exercise, in order to, don't shake your head, she's like, don't do it to me again. It'll be fun, I promise. At least fun for me, I don't know. So again, the instructions are straightforward. Everyone knows their colors. And the instructions are which color is each word. So if I asked you that right now, what would you say? Very good, you know your colors and you can follow instructions. We're gonna go fast so that we can wrap up fast. What about now?
Red, blue,
More confidence.
black,
Okay, what about this one?
green, white, green, red, white,
Okay,
purple.
okay, better. That you recovered so much better, I'm very proud of you. And here's what happened just now. You all had, your mind just had a battle. Your conscious mind and your unconscious mind just fought each other, right? Your unconscious mind saw words on the screen and said, read, because that's what you do with words, you read them. Your conscious mind was given instructions though. I told you to tell me the color of the word. And in the beginning you got distracted because it was easy. And when complexity showed up, we defaulted to the unconscious mind because we were like distracted, this lady's crazy, all that other stuff. And that landed us to make a mistake. Just that quick. And this is how all of this stuff, like this is how racism works, but this is also how advancing racial equity works. Our ability to take a step back and remember what is the actual mission at hand. If we're talking about climate change, if we're talking about people, the mission at hand is to figure out how do we make sure we're doing this work that people aren't negatively impacted unnecessarily. And how do we make sure that we're not making life worse for others? This idea of bouncing forward after disasters is not just talk. It's important to our ability to actually make the kinds of transformative change that we can make. And there's a whole area of resilience now that's about transformative resilience, right? How do we not just build back things better, but how do we acknowledge that there's a historical context and a social context in every community that we're building back in, and that we need to incorporate people into the conversation in powerful, meaningful ways so that we don't do the pothole stuff. Because if it's not our struggle, it's invisible to us, right? And so that's why we need other people at the table to help us with this. And then here's where I'm going to, I already said this, right? I did that just for you. Bam. Okay, so we're gonna do, this is how we're gonna wrap up. This is my daughter's favorite humility exercise. She helps me come up with these. My youngest daughter, she was 11, she'll be 12. So this is the last one. Blinking or alternating. Okay, you're gonna tell me if they're blinking at the same time or if they're alternating. It is not blinking yet, so don't freak out if you don't see anything happening. Ready? Here we go. Alternating or same time? How many people say same time? Okay, how many people say alternating? All right, let's do this. Let's take those circles off. What is it doing now? Okay, Let me go back. I promise, this is just PowerPoint. I am not doing anything but PowerPoint right now. It's not a trick. Our brain does stuff like this to us all the time, which is why us being responsible, building up our self-mastery, which means understanding ourselves in this larger context, but also tools that will help us think more critically in moments, especially when complexity shows up. It is of the utmost paramount that we do these things. Critical thinking is not something we're born with. It's a skill we have to develop, and when we don't have it, we make decisions like what we've been doing. We're also afraid of not doing what we've been doing. We also continue to make the same kinds of decisions that reinforce the negative impacts of climate change and reinforce racial inequities. So I am going to land right here where I promised. So there's the contact information again, and I think I get to hand it over to David. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. I know we want to get to the discussion, and that was very thought-provoking, and there's a great conversation. There's a great conversation to be had. My name is David Sittenfeld, and I'm kind of here in two roles. I manage the Forum program, the Forums and National Collaborations program at the Museum of Science, and I'm also a doctoral researcher in Professor Helmut's lab, who you heard from, I think, in the first class, and it's an honor to be a part of this panel and part of this course. I want to thank the organizers for hosting this course. I think we just heard a lot about why it's important from the three previous speakers. I know that's a mouthful, but I think it will make sense and also connect really well to what we heard from the previous three speakers about the need for planning and people-centered resilience strategies as we go forward, especially thinking about how these impacts of climate change are likely to have disproportionate impacts on different groups of people if we don't think about that deliberatively from the start. I'm going to talk a little bit about work that I've been doing with partners from Professor Helmut's lab and a number of partners around the country on two NOAA-funded grants that have supported us over the last 4 years or so. And I'm going to start with the national name of the project before I zoom in on Boston, because I'm going to end with something that I'm hoping you'll do. And most of you here in Boston will be able to come and physically do it at the Museum of Science, but I'll end by saying if there's anybody watching online, I hope you'll reach out to your local science museum and make sure you're part of this too. And I'll talk about that a little later. And so we have a project called Citizen Science, Civics, and Resilient Communities that's intended to get people thinking from the very perspectives we've been hearing about in the earlier talks. Thinking about preparing for resilience around the societal and ethical dimensions of every engineering decision that we make. We try to figure out how to make a community resilient to these kinds of changes, and think about the perspective of a group of diverse stakeholders and their different priorities and needs with respect to the trade-offs of a number of proposed resilience strategies that we could take. And we do that through two complementary methods of active learning. Citizen science, which is participatory data collection in a community, where communities help to figure out what it is they want to find out and help to inform what we think we know in science, and deliberative policy making. People come together to make decisions with the idea that these decisions are best made with the inclusion of diverse perspectives and social values. And so I'm going to start by focusing on a case study, which was our pilot effort that happened here in Boston. It's gotten quite a bit of attention. It's called Wicked Hot Boston. If you Google that, I guarantee you'll find our project website, and I'll show you some examples later on. And the public part that you've probably heard the most about was a community heat mapping exercise that involved about 50 volunteers from around the city of Boston. We did it in 3 communities, Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline, in which people got into vehicles with these things that look kind of like selfie sticks on them, or car flags. They are thermometers with GPS-enabled data loggers and humidity sensors in them to help us understand a little bit more about the very block level, and even in some cases sub-block level, of vulnerabilities to extreme heat and the impacts on people in a neighborhood of what that means to people at the core. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about. And this was one of the ultimate deliverables of that project, a very high resolution. You'll see how high resolution in a minute. heat map of the regional area that can be zoomed down, and you'll be able to do that online, and I'll show you some examples. But first, a little bit of context, which we heard about from several of the speakers before. Extreme heat is, we often call it the silent storm, because it is actually the highest mortality threat of any of these natural disasters, both worldwide and in the United States each year, in terms of how many people it kills. And we've already heard that it has a disproportionate impacts on communities of color, and also people who are older or socially vulnerable or isolated in various ways. We'll talk about that. And we heard from Brian, who oversaw much of this work at the City of Boston, that it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And there are some projections, such as the ones he mentioned, that we're going to go from 11 days of 90 degrees to the equivalent of Birmingham, Alabama, here by 2070 or so, which is a pretty big change. I think we're all hoping for the lower end of that curve. And so what we produced was a campaign. The Wicked Hot Boston campaign was a campaign to activate local knowledge to help it sort of make decisions better about extreme heat, and it started with community investigation. So we used a citizen science project online that you can look up today. It's called I See Change. These people are amazing. They allow you to go out and collect data through your own voice and your own camera. You take pictures in your neighborhood of things that you think are important as these hazards go and make themselves happen in the world with your words. So here's just one example from Emily, who actually is on my team, but we had lots of people not on my team doing this. And you can see she's talking about the heat while she was waiting for the bus in Central Square. And you can see that her picture is also connected to data from the local weather station or satellite, depending on which investigation you're doing. For the extreme heat investigation, this is from the local weather station, I believe. And she's telling people in this community what she's experiencing during a heat wave. And people around the world are able to look at that, and the data go to researchers. And we use this as a way of going up a ladder of engagement, a participatory ladder to try to get you to do a little bit more. And that's, I'll talk about this later with flooding, because you have an opportunity to do it. So of those people, and of many others who didn't do that, we encourage them to, as I said, get into a car and help us characterize vulnerabilities using this method that you might have read about in the New York Times and National Geographic. There's researchers from Portland State University and the Science Museum of Virginia who pioneered this and did it in several communities that you can see here. And so we did 10 transects, polygons around Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline that was selected with planners from those cities. You'll see a picture of them in a little while. We got community input on what it should be too. So we knew, for example, we wanted to ride around this section of East Boston somewhere, and we had community planners and residents tell us, well, where should we drive? Right now, there were certain parameters. You can only go, up to 30 miles an hour, and you have to go at least 10. So that meant certain places are not good to go at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because there were 3 times of transects: 6 a.m., 3 p.m., and 7 p.m. So we have to thank all those people that got up early in the morning, drove around 6 o'clock in the morning during the heat wave to help us understand this information. And what it ends up getting turned into is a model that's based on land use, land cover, that helps predict at a very high resolution, you'll see in a minute, what people are going to experience during these heat waves now and later, using machine learning techniques that are based on the data from the transects. So a quick summary of the findings. What that top bullet point means is that they use the data in 2 ways. They use 70% of the data to inform the model I talked about, and they kept 30% of the data to say, is the model working? And they used it to back project in those sort of polygons about whether the modeling was good. And from previous papers, including that Journal of Climate, we knew it would be, but it's comforting to know that the sort of back prediction was over 95% in all the cases. So this is real, particularly near the areas where the transects happen. And so we can immediately look and see some of the places that are popping up hot on that map. And we saw big differences at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, differences of over 15 degrees Fahrenheit of what people in the city are experiencing during a heat wave. Now you do this on a hot day. We did it on January 29th and 30th. You might remember those were very, very hot, and it was the hottest year on record for the city of Boston. So I guess you could say we got lucky in terms of the data collection. Whether we got lucky or not is another thing to think about. And so you can see some of the hot spots: East Boston, North End, Dorchester, South End. There are many more showing up on this map. I'm naming those because those are the places where the data are actually collected, not just modeled. There are interesting places like Chelsea, Revere, Everett, Somerville, where the model is showing us we better go back there and take some more data because there's probably good vulnerabilities to investigate there that we know are real, related to land use and other kinds of things. And so there's kind of a magic formula here that seems to pop up from highways, unshaded areas, not a lot of green space, and away from the water. And so we look at those areas in Boston, we can probably guess where we're talking about. And this was the hottest. Ashmont was measured at a temperature of 102.6 degrees at 3 o'clock. I happened to have been in the car during that time in Ashmont, and I can tell you it was quite hot. And so you can see, the resolution of these maps. I can zoom down, and you'll see a picture actually in a minute of how we did it. But you can see right around this area near the MBTA stop is where this temperature was recorded from a data logger. And that's not a model temperature, that was actually recorded through the temperature. So what did that look like? So here I was able to pull the data set into Google Earth and give you a chance to see Street View. What are people living when it's 102 degrees outside? And from the shade here, for the shadow here, you can see there's not a lot of shade in this area. Unshaded areas are the ones that really popped up hot. And this is not a huge surprise. I mean, I'm sure you heard all about this earlier in this class. But we know what communities like Ashmont and Dorchester are dealing with when we look at these areas. This is an area in the South End, for example, that just did not have a lot of green space. Happily, not a lot of people live in this area right now, but that's changing due to all sorts of issues that I know many of you are experts in. And it's really interesting to see how small the difference is, or how big the difference can be with a small amount of distance. This is, to me, the most interesting finding that I've played around with the data so far. You might say it doesn't look like that much. It's 96 degrees. That's not even close to 102.6. Why are you pointing this out? Well, within 500 yards of each other was the hottest location and the coolest location that we recorded in the city of Brookline. Just the impacts of this pond or Route 9 had a difference of about 11 degrees Fahrenheit, 500 yards from each other. And that really gives us, I think, some optimism. There are things that we can do. There are simple resilient strategies that we can take to help with the impacts from a public health and an infrastructural perspective that we don't have to wait 30 or 50 years to do. Those are things that we do need to do, but there's things that we can do. We identify vulnerabilities right now for those communities that are really up against it now and in the future. So, going against all of that is what we just heard about, right? So these, I saw that Dr. Martin was speaking, and so I pulled some of her data sets. Instead of the statistical significance, I did them as percent of the total, but you'll see very similar patterns, and then you look at the map. So have I started doing cross correlations? Yes, we have. You can, I'll show them at some point, but you can probably see some pretty big, and this is verified in other cities, pretty big similarities between where these people who are socially vulnerable to where, the heat is hitting the most. And you might have seen the articles last week about some of the same authors who sort of pioneered this, having looked at the redlining data across all of the country. And so we know that some of these places are hot because of structural inequities and disparities that were established 100 years ago, and things that we're still sort of trying to deal with. And so we need to think hard about what that means in terms of what people can do to become resilient in this capacity. So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing is we need to talk about it. And so just gathering the data, that got a lot of attention, but here's what happened next. We got people, all the ones that helped to volunteer, and city planners, and anybody else who wanted to come to the Wicked Forum. And these people are sitting around. This is Nancy Smith from the Boston Public Health Commission. There are many other people there who are deliberating on the trade-offs of a number of proposed resilience strategies using visualizations and other things that I'll talk about in just a minute, and thinking about what it means to try to become more resilient and what it means for different kinds of people. I'm going to skip this because we don't have time. And so we've also tried to get it out there. So we had a social conversation, and you'll hear more about that in just a minute, but we've also tried to make sure that data belong to anybody. So there's a website you can go to. If you Google Wicked Hot Boston, you can play around the data yourself, but it was recently recorded in the Climate Ready Boston update, and then there's a high-profile NPR story that we've been pushing out so that you can go out and you can play around with this yourself. And what can you do about it? So my research focuses on what we call the science-to-civics process, and this is the idea of getting out people to go out there, collect data, thinking about a citizen science project that connects to a locally focused resilience planning priority, and then convening a forum about what to do based on what these people have created in terms of local or indigenous knowledge, and then taking action. And that requires all of these different kinds of people: resilience planners, people thinking about social and structural inequities in our society, people working on solutions, and people who have characterized vulnerabilities through citizen science, all working together to do it. And you have an opportunity to participate. We'll do Wicked Hot Blossom again this summer, but I have a much closer, near-term ask of you, an invitation of you. This is part of a larger national project I mentioned called Citizen Science, Civics, and Resilience Communities, and with Professor Helma's help and people in his lab, we created deliberations around 4 hazards: heat waves, extreme precipitation, sea level rise, and drought. And these are deliberate materials that were used at 8 science museums in a previous grant and follow the Climate Resilience Toolkit. If you don't know about the Climate Resilience Toolkit, it's a wonderful tool. It's what resilience planners often learn through NOAA's paradigm about how to become more resilient by looking at case studies from other people are focusing. And this is what the professionals learn to use, and we created a layperson version of it using visualizations for various communities. This is a real community you might recognize as Charleston, South Carolina. We've anonymized it and put data and people into the conversation. Here's how it works. The participants begin by considering a diverse group of stakeholder perspectives. There are 6 for each hazard. These are 1, this is from the extreme precipitation one. This happens to be 1 from the sea level rise. This is Jonathan. He's an emergency room doctor, and he's quite worried because his hospital serves low-income communities and was identified in the city's vulnerability assessment as being vulnerable to sea level rise. So he wants it renovated, but he's also worried because if they close it down to renovate it, people in the neighborhood don't necessarily have a place to go during emergencies. And so this is a trade-off for him, and he's trying to figure out what to do. It also will affect his own commute getting in there to serve people in his community. And the participants have to think about not only Jonathan, but all of these stakeholders and the perspectives of others in the neighborhood through the lens of 3 resilience strategies that we mine from resilience plans around the country and around the world. So this happens to be, for example, for the extreme precipitation one, and the participants think about what the director of community health or a local resident in a floodplain or a soybean farmer might think of the idea of hard engineered barriers, or infrastructural strategies or green ones to accommodate water or public information campaigns, and try to think about what they would want the city to spend the most money on given trade-offs that have been ranked for economic, environmental, and social parameters. And then they have to do something difficult. They have to make a plan within an atmosphere of constrained resources. So just like the people we've heard about, we don't have all the money and we want to try to do the best job we can. So the participants get 3 poker chips, and these things cost a lot, these things cost less, and they have to decide what they're going to do. So they make a plan. In this case, this group decided to do a lot of green strategies and public information campaign, and they get to explore their resilience plan through visualizations and news stories that we mine from resilience stories around the world, and visualizations at the 50,000-foot individual level for what happens. And unlike the real world, they get to revisit their idea and see if they change their mind, which we don't get to do in the real world. And so I want to invite you to do this because there are different parts to this process and you can be part of them. The first thing out there is to go out there and help us understand more about how you're experiencing vulnerabilities. So our next forum is the Wicked High Tide Forum, and the Wicked High Tide Forum is going to happen at the Museum of Science, and members of the Helmuth Lab are creating visualizations of things that you can create, which are going out in your neighborhood during storms or high tides, and taking pictures using an app called MyCoast that goes to the Coastal Zone Management Office for Massachusetts. So they use this data. And so if you go to this website, scischroeder.org/NODA, Scischroeder is a portal for citizen science projects. About 2 million people use it. And if you go there, you can click on MyCoast or Icy Change, and you can submit an observation during the storms that happened this weekend, or other ones that happened in the time since, and we'll visualize those for you, and you can come and deliberate about what to do during times of inundation and planning for resilience. And if you do that, you'll be part of a team that's doing it at 28 places, because we're doing it at 8 more this summer and at 20 more in the 3rd year. So there'll be 28 science museums doing this and hoping to help increase resilience, working with civic planners in each of these locations through a large-scale network that Professor Helmuth and I are part of. So I want to stop there and say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to meeting you at one of these events.
speaking of resilience, those of you here in the auditorium noticed we had some technical difficulties, and people watching our live stream had some moments there of quiet. And I just want to commend Ava and Abby for their resilience at nonstop problem solving. Abby has been holding her cell phone this entire time to make sure that we don't lose the content for the people who are watching on live stream. So thank you both so much, and props to that. I want to be cognizant of our time because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but I just have a burning one that I would like to throw out there to kick things off. Ted, you can't imagine. It seems like this is a grand reckoning of every social issue, every health issue, every infrastructure and public planning issue, every design issue. Like all of these vulnerabilities and opportunities are being laid bare. And from what you said, we know what many of these issues are. We've been dealing with them for a long time, but they are being amplified and exacerbated by climate change. And the grand reckoning seems to me to be understanding we have some solutions. And the question so often comes down to, do we have the values and the will to own what these issues are, and then to implement the whole range of solutions? And I was just wondering if you could comment on that, because I think it's the thread that ties together all of your presentations tonight.
Easy answer. So I think for me, so I remain hopeful for some reason. I remain hopeful that we can help people to develop the will. I think, at least from where I sit, kind of at this intersection of all of these things, that there's a clear unwillingness, right, to even talk about some of the more complex things that are under these issues that are hidden from a lot of people's view. But I have seen in the work that I do with organizations, when people have the information for themselves, when they go through a process for themselves in order to have those aha moments, right, that people see the world differently. Right? So if you didn't notice during the presentation, I love quotes. And so Max Planck, the physicist, has a quote that says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And so I have seen that over and over again with individuals and in organizations, and even when I was Chief Resilience Officer, in working with all these different city departments on trying to figure out what can we collectively be doing based on what we have right now today, right? And then also looking at what it means when we have businesses working with community, working with government, sitting down thinking about what does all this mean to all of us, and where are our opportunities to get in there and kind of have impact. And so from that experience and working in emergency management, I land at a place where when people are not told and preached at, when they are walked through a process where they can uncover for themselves their relationship to these issues, that it evolves their ability to see more opportunities in action. So I'll stop there.
I'm optimistic. But I call it the resilience paradox, because as I laid out in the outset, what's animating the need for resilience is hyperconnectivity, which then often translates into a shock and cascades in much more serious ways. But the solution is we need connectedness. That is, to build the solutions are bottom-up, inclusive ways to tackle these challenges. And we have tools that support that collective sets of actions. And so, but that's at its heart, what gives us more resilience is a strong civil society. There actually is no other way to get to it. And so, and whenever we're building more stronger civil society, we're a better place. We're a better community. And so there's no downside to investing in resilience in terms of the method it takes, which is engagement. Now, what I'm worried about is the politics of fear, which actually seem to really work, particularly in supporting a demagoguery and authoritarian sort of models. That is to emphasize your vulnerability and also that you're powerless to deal with those vulnerabilities. And so when I keep doing that, then you go, well, who's going to help me? And that's what fuels this sort of centralized, top-down, look to the sort of, man on the white horse kind of thing. So the resilience, though, narrative works entirely contrary to that, because it's about us being empowered. It's about looking to each other, building the civil society that really makes us the kind of special place we all want to live in. And so taking it on is all about being in a better place and not being seduced by the politics of fear. And I'm confident in a vibrant democracy, and I think we've got some challenges on it here, but it is about, it helps reinforce and makes that democracy more vibrant. And that's a place we all need to go, to tackle these challenges, to tap the innovation, to tap the capability across our civil society. I'm convinced we're going to be in a better place, but we have to step up and say we're going to do it.
I guess I'll be the downer on the panel. I am extremely concerned. We have the magnitude of the challenge in front of us, both from the resilience standpoint in terms of our lack of resilience to climate change, and the opportunity for us to bend the curve to get to net carbon neutrality by mid-century. Both of those have a time lag built into them that the human psyche has not proven so far to be able to raise its sense of urgency to address as quickly as it needs to. We will know. I will gladly come back in 10 years and be proven wrong, right? Because that's the other terrifying part of this is we'll know this decade that we just started on January 1st, whether or not we're on a trajectory to limit the massive catastrophic impacts of climate change for the entire world, including, in particular vulnerable populations here, but we didn't spend time on entire countries, right, around the world that will cease to exist functionally. What happens to the people of Bangladesh? Right? Where do they go? What happens to folks in coastal India? What happens to the folks in coastal East Africa? Massive social and migration upheaval in a period in time where we seem to be positioning ourselves into looking more inward rather than collectively of how we help each other out for something that we as a species have been facing. So this next decade is the most critical decade for action. It certainly needs further study, but for action, right? And we are much better served by taking too much action to address this and saying, oh, we decarbonize too fast, than by saying we missed the opportunity to get below 1.5 degrees. Because if we're not below 1.5 degrees, this is functionally a different planet to live on for the current generation that is graduating from Northeastern within their lifetime. Right?
Yes, should we open it to questions?
She raised her hand over there for the laptop.
Hi, first of all, thank you, all of you, for being here and for taking the time to share your knowledge and your experiences with us. I really appreciate it. My question is for Dr. Flynn. You spoke about how institutions have a role in furthering resilience efforts for the surrounding communities. I'm wondering if you feel like Northeastern is doing this effectively, and if not, what are you doing to leverage your power to encourage more action?
Put your money where your mouth is. Absolutely, Northeastern could be doing more and should be doing more, and I think as any major university should be engaged in that. I think it is doing a good bit, but I am impatient, and I think for the very reasons we laid out here. There's a specific effort that we're trying to advance, which is building a microgrid based on solar that involves our neighbors in Roxbury. It takes advances of the Boston Housing Authority, potentially by deploying solar panels on rooftops. Ideally, what we'd be doing is we'd be training folks to actually do that job, those installations, providing jobs and support, and then Northeastern be potentially the anchor customer for the excess energy being produced. Those are the kinds of models, good neighbor things. It just makes so much sense. And it takes a bit to move big organizations and big bureaucracies, but there are lots of models out there. And the other thing I think that we got to do, and it goes back to the connected network, there has to be a way in which we share these stories, in some cases chain each other into doing the right thing. But if you have a social mission, as a university does, you have to look at your surrounding community and neighborhood and be that very good neighbor. And certainly my colleague here, Ted Lansmark, is an exemplar of that, and there's just more of it that needs to happen.
with taking a more anthropocentric focus. So I was just wondering, I guess, to all of the panelists, how do you think that we could work towards resilience not only for humans, but also for our ecosystems and our other organisms in general?
So it's a very good question and a hard question. The way that we dealt with it in the forums that we created was by trying to get people to think critically about the trade-offs of proposed resilience strategies. And we gave them environmental, economic, and social factors to weigh when trying to think about not only what they would want, but what other people in their community might value. And you know, we have some good evaluation data to show that what I'm going to say has some merit behind it, but there's still more we have to learn. And it's that if you spend a little bit of time thinking outside your own mind about what people around the table and represented in these perspectives and that you fill in yourself, that you're going to make a decision that might be sort of more holistic than it would be if it was just by yourself. And so an underlying assumption of all of this, or an ethos anyway, that is that decisions are made better when a variety of diverse perspectives are brought to that decision. And so we try to encourage people to think about that, but I know that doesn't answer the question completely.
I'll just add to that, that I think there's an assumption that they're separate and they're not. People are more sophisticated in their understanding than we give them credit for, especially in communities. And so what a lot of people don't realize is the impacts of climate change aren't just the things we've been talking about. It's also invasive species, right, that are impacting the ecosystem in the city of Boston. I've done community focus groups in the work I do now, talking about these issues, and folks are bringing these issues up on their own. Like, they're talking about, hey, I've been living here for 30 years, and there are geese in my backyard. We've never had geese in this area before, ever, right? And so how do we protect them? What does this mean for the environment that in our neighborhood? What does it mean for all the other living species of things? And so I think people, given the space and the opportunity, we actually are really good at connecting the dots. It's just we always have to have something to anchor us to make sure that we're connecting those dots, right? So then when we're talking about the environment, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about all these things that we're always thinking about how are they connected to each other and the connection to people.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's valuable to think about the beneficiaries of the solution sets we're talking about are broad, and you're going to lead with the one that is going to resonate most with whoever you're trying to encourage to change their behavior, right? And so if we're trying to establish an action-based political movement to move as quickly as we can to correct the institutional issues, the governance issues, to get these policies embedded, we need to be honest with ourselves that, like, the pictures of polar bears on icebergs didn't work, right? The most effective marketing campaign, early on was EDF's with a parent standing in front of an oncoming train saying this is climate change, but I'm going to be gone by the time it impacts, and steps aside and his daughter's standing right there. Like, once we made it personal, we're saying you all in the room are going to be impacted by this. It's not just some polar bear that you're never going to see far away. In Alaska, folks started paying much more attention. It doesn't mean that the solutions don't also have massive impacts on our ecosystems. It's the most significant thing we can do to stop our species crisis, our extinction crisis, is to do everything we can to keep that 1.5 degrees as low as possible. Right?
I just wanted to share kind of one example that I just learned last week in Lima, Peru, and it was about how we get this potentially right. There's a unique nut growing in the rainforest, only in Peru, that just turned out to have really high omega contents, really good antitoxins. And so the sudden realization that this is actually a really high value, and so now the people who are indigent in that area now have a pretty lucrative product, now invested in protecting that very lucrative product. And so you now have a much different model about how you can sustain that community. Right? So the discovery and then the empowerment that came from that discovery linked them more closely to the existing natural environment showing that benefit is very, very powerful. And I think there are a lot more things out there like that, again, if we take some of these approaches, will get us to a better place.
All right, we have time for one more question.
I was an accounting major, so.
Oh. Yeah, that's fine. That's good.
My question is in terms of the U.S. government. The fact that there's no acceptance of climate change, and the fact is that how does it impact on a negative basis the fact that the government does not recognize the administration doesn't recognize it, and doesn't recognize any of the efforts that are being made throughout the world for this? Does that make it a lot more difficult to try to get some of these proposals out that you've been talking about?
Yes. I will say though, that is, the only, I don't call it a silver lining, it's a tin one, okay? But it is that so many more said, right, well, we better get on with us. I said this, and whether it's at the city or the state, and the connecting of cities and efforts around. And since many of the solutions will have to be more grassroots, more bottom up, more localized. And if we were also waiting for the central to get it right and tell us what to do, that's not a good form either. But bottom line, it would really be helpful if Washington was pulling with us instead of against us on some of these efforts.
I would just quickly add it's the White House that doesn't appreciate climate change. There are elements within government, because it takes more than a single term of a single administration to change government. Right? So I worked at EPA in the early 2000s under Christy Todd Whitman, and I got to tell you, the Defense Department was the best at appreciating and dealing with climate change by far. And they're still the leading government agency of saying, because they have to build forward bases that are inherently energy independent, that are risk to all of the elements we have at the extreme, and there is significant risk of loss of life if they don't get that right. So, the progress we were making over the last, over the Obama administration on embedding this, can't get wiped out in 4 years. You can make a lot more damage in 8 years, but, and yes, the federal government is at a very significant point, needs to be part of the solution now that states, cities, and now the business community are light years ahead of where the federal government is at.
In other words, engage.
Well, and I would just note, the New York Times noted this past weekend that there are a number of states that are applying for federal funding for initiatives, and those states include Texas and South Carolina, where all of the language they're using in their proposals is about climate change, but they're not using the word climate change. So there is still work that's going on in a number of areas. It's just being recharacterized linguistically. But the bottom line is there's an election this year.
There is. And with that, we pause together, take our weekly deep breath. Remember what actions we're going to try to think about doing this week, what we're all going to learn. Please keep us on your calendar. We have 10 more weeks of this. Thank you all so much for being here this week.
All the time, like I can edit the best. That's really, I forgot to ask a question.